All right, good afternoon. By way of introduction, my name is Jeff Scheaffer. It is thrilling to be here, and I appreciate everybody's time today. What I'm very excited to have an opportunity to talk to all of you about is based on all of the discussions we've had with your peers across all of the Mideast and Africa. We've been taking away a lot of learnings that we wanted to share and recap today in terms of the next generation of innovations around how we can do a better job of securing the digital experiences and the digital infrastructure through simplification. And so what we'll do is we'll get started with that conversation now. So the breakthroughs in the next era of security operations are really going to occur in four major areas of discipline. So number one is in core security innovation. So as we innovate around the core security services, how do they start to coalesce or consolidate into a platform? Number two, it is all about the data. Attacks are getting more sophisticated, and because the attacks are more sophisticated, we need to have more telemetry information, and not just telemetry that we can aggregate, but native telemetry that we can correlate and we can map into attack frameworks like the MITRE ATT&CK framework to do a better job of identifying attacks and vulnerabilities. In addition to that, it's the innovation that will apply to our domain around artificial intelligence. The important part of artificial intelligence is how do we improve core security efficacy and efficiency by being able to identify risks and vulnerabilities and threats at machine speed, at greater than human scale, and below human sensitivity to the identification of the threat. And as we improve all of these core capabilities, whether it's consolidating tools into single platforms and the simplicity of reducing the complexity of our security configurations to the cloud native and domain telemetry, and then artificial intelligence, we also need to take another step, which is the dramatic simplification of the security experience. And how do we simplify the implementation of security controls to make it safer for everybody? So let's talk about these four topics. Core security innovation. The challenge we're all facing today is that innovation in the security domains is actually a patchwork. All of you have experienced this. Every time there's a new exploit, we develop a new tool. If there's spam, it was Proofpoint. If there was stolen credentials and compromise on the endpoint, CrowdStrike. And as we continue to look at all of the new threats that we find that there is an ecosystem of vendors that develop that specifically address that threat. And each of those vendors does a really good job at that very specific task. Now the challenge is, it's a proliferation. And as we look at how we pull all of those vendor tools together, we end up with a very complex security stack. It is not uncommon today to find that in a typical security operations center that we have 70 to 150 different tools that are all being used within that security environment. And as the environments have transitioned into the multi-cloud future, the problem has only become more difficult. Because not only did we develop this ecosystem of tools, but every single environment, whether it's a private cloud, AWS, Azure, Google, or any of the other cloud platforms that are present here within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, for example, like Alibaba, there's a different tool chain that's developed around each and every one of these platforms. And so this is one of the areas where within CISCO, we have a specific opportunity to drive innovation and simplification in the security tool chains. Our view of that is that there is a role between these multiple cloud environments, so public cloud services to the private cloud, about how do we bring the network and the security controls together into a single cloud security platform. This provides independence across the multi-cloud environment, as well as it allows us to evolve to a single platform of consolidated tools where we can have a single cloud management platform for the orchestration, the configuration, and the operation of the security controls. We can have a shared set of services that improve the efficacy and the consistency of implementation of the control points across the various tools based on policy, identity, single SLAs, et cetera. So this becomes one of the major areas of innovation is the evolution of platforms. The second thing about the evolution of platforms is that the market will coalesce around two platforms. One that's focused on the endpoint and the app, and the other one that's going to be focused on the network and the cloud. And we believe that within CISCO, with our rich heritage of network capabilities, we're going to be the company that is in the position to consolidate that cloud and network control platform. And in doing so, we will provide a specific set of advancements to the users by simplifying the user experience, to the IT by a single management platform to configure, orchestrate, and operate the security controls, by incorporating all of this into the DevOps lifecycle, and then finally making it safer for everyone by having a much more robust set of security capabilities. So we've talked about one major trend, which is the evolution of core security and the evolution towards platforms. The second one that we want to talk about is the importance of cross-domain and native telemetry services. So the challenge that we're all facing today is that the state of the industry at the moment is really about how do we take telemetry information on a domain-by-domain basis. We aggregate that information up into a single set of security tools, and then we aggregate it further into a SIM solution. And that's helpful, but it requires a lot of threat hunting. It requires a lot of skill in the analyst in order to be able to piece together all of that information. But there's a better approach that we can start to take, and that's the evolution towards what we consider cross-domain native telemetry. And what happens in the cross-domain native telemetry is that rather than taking data and synthesizing it through an intermediary and aggregating it, we're now taking native data directly into a correlation engine and being able to look at the multivariate effect of that data in order to start to pinpoint actual exploits that are slowly occurring over time because we're looking at all of the multiple native signals. And that becomes a very important part of being able to succeed is this idea of native data that can then be used in our XDR solutions, the extended detection and response capabilities. So that's another kind of key capability. So platforms, the cross-domain native telemetry services, and then finally, now that we have the platform, now that we have this rich data set, how do we possibly bring all of this together into actionable intelligence for the Security Operations Center? And this is really about how do we start to leverage AI technologies. Now, AI technologies are not new. AI technologies have been around roughly 100 years. There's a broad collection of them: machine learning, deep learning, machine reasoning, Bayesian analytics. But more recently, there's contemporary approaches around, for example, large language models and generative AI. And how do we apply that to this broad set of cross-domain native telemetry information to drive better insights? And so the very first part of that is three things that are needed to succeed here. One is you need to have that rich data. Number two, you have to have the domain-specific models that are designed to take the specific telemetry data that you have and be able to generate quick insights. We're incorporating models, for example, in Cisco, and there's several in the industry, for example, based on like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, where we can correlate signal from multiple data sources and develop, based on patterns of attacks, being able to correlate the signal in order to come up with an inferences to the attack and respond to it. And then in addition to that, how do we simplify the way we leverage those powerful AI technologies through a simplified experience like a generative AI system, which becomes the new prompt or the prompt interface into your Security Operations Center. So think of that, for example, like how can I use a prompt to summarize an incident and take all of the information we've collected and quickly summarize an incident as part of the case workload? Or how do I quickly use prompts in order to generate, for example, zero trust policy and scale out the efficacy of my security operations? So at the end of the day, AI has a tremendous opportunity to improve efficacy and efficiency by helping us scale beyond human scale, below human sensitivity. And then finally, we've talked about the platform, we've talked about the telemetry, we've talked about applying the intelligence. The last thing is how do we start to make it easier for everyone to realize the benefit of these technologies and simplify their experience. And I want to talk about a number of the places where we're finding that by creating an equal breakthrough, not only in the core technology, but also in the adoption or the user experience of that, how it creates a safer environment for everyone. So as an example, when we think about how do you secure connectivity to an application from a user or a subject to a resource or an application, today, in the industry, we create a really complex environment. Number one is we force all of our users to be very aware of the underlying technology, whether it's connecting through zero trust architectures, VPNs, or going directly to the internet. In order to connect to your application, whether it's web, SaaS, or private, or a legacy application, we force the users to have all of that knowledge and that experience. But what would happen if we reimagined that experience in its entirety? So with Cisco Secure Access, which is our most comprehensive security service edge solution in the market today, we started out from the end user, and we worked backward to build up the architecture to change the user experience. And in doing so, we have a single agent. That single agent has a set of microservices that provide for zero trust. They provide for VPN as a service. They provide for the posture. They provide for the digital experience. They provide for the ability to collect the telemetry information to identify exploits at the endpoint, and brings all of that together into a single experience. But the user experience is it. The simplicity is they authenticate to the device, they connect to the network, and they go to work. And no matter which application it is, we figure out what the plumbing is that's needed in order to provide that connectivity. In addition to that, that architecture also allowed us to completely imagine the simplicity of how do we transition from legacy castle and moat architectures into zero trust architectures by reimagining the journey of how we move network applications into zero trust. And what we found with that inside of Cisco is that roughly 60% of applications conform to zero trust architecture, 40% applications still require a VPN as a service type connectivity or a direct network access. And what happens with that is if your ZTNA controls work really well, or zero trust access controls work really well for client-initiated applications. But if you have applications that are server-initiated, like monitoring and troubleshooting tools, if you have multi-channel applications, like ERP applications, like SAP Reports, which has a multi-channel response. If you have, for example, applications that are peer-to-peer or site-to-site, like SIP and IP telephony, they need to have a different approach. And so we, in Cisco, look to simplify the experience by providing that endpoint that we just previously discussed has all of the underlying multiple tunnel, multiple head-end technologies in order to support the full breadth of application architectures with that frictionless experience for the end user. In addition to that, how do we provide a great user experience in general? And so with that, as we look at the connectivity of users to applications, we want to build it into Cisco's networking infrastructure. We then make that available in a global network of points of presence across both our edge data centers and public cloud services, including, most recently, the announced local node here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in order to provide that security controls close to the user, close to the application. We don't want to backhaul the user to the security control. In addition to that, the low latency connectivity and built on industry or leading protocols like QUIC and MASC framework, which are designed for the modern era. And then bringing that all together into a single view, which is based on the end user experience, looking at our digital experience based on 1,000 eyes, powered by our 1,000 eyes, which gives us full stack observability from the client across the local area network to the wide area network into the applications in order to see what is the actual application experience and be able to troubleshoot any application, network, or end user connectivity experience. Now, we talked about, in terms of simplifying the experience of the end user, we've talked about the robustness of that zero trust evolutionary journey. We've talked now about the pervasiveness of the connectivity architecture and infrastructure that supports that. But how do we also then take one step further? We've not only secured the connectivity, but how do we do extra validation, for example, multi-factor authentication? And so oftentimes what we're doing in our platform is with the MFA, or single sign-on services, the first time we validate the user, we can persist that validation, and as long as nothing changes about the subject on a known network with a device and a user and a source application, we can continue to inherit that authorization for additional network application connectivity. But if something changes, for example, you leave the office and you go next door to the coffee shop and the SSID of the Wi-Fi changes, we will trap that change in posture, and we can force the revalidation of the user. When we force the revalidation of the user, it's simple. We push the validation, you can acknowledge it, and the connectivity continues. But if, for example, we want to have a more stringent set of policies, depending on the application, we may want to do verified push. So when you get the pushback, you actually have to put in the PIN code, which allows us to have a more stringent set of security services, not just based on push fatigue. So frustrating the attackers, but not the users by simplifying the amount of times. In addition to simplifying the user experience, we also want to solve problematic IT problems. For example, today we talk about the patchwork of security controls and vendors. When we bring all of that into a single management platform, we're able to greatly start to simplify all of the complexity around having a single centralized cloud management platform to orchestrate, configure, and operate security controls. Specifically, it's one source of identity and posture. It's a unified policy. It's a single SLA across all of the cloud, edge, and endpoint security capabilities that make up the connectivity framework, and brings that all together into a single platform with a single data source and AI technologies to greatly simplify the IT experience. So not just better for the user, but also simpler for IT. Then what happens is we want to say, okay, great, we've connected all the connectivity, the multi-factor authentication. We've simplified the IT experience, but what happens when we start to move these applications out of traditional infrastructure and into the cloud? What happens in traditional infrastructure today is we use segmentation technologies, either macro or micro segmentation, in order to secure application workloads in data centers. Macro segmentation to secure north-south, micro segmentation to secure the east-west. The key thing is segmentation is primarily driven based on IP and IP address ranges. What happens, though, is once you start going into moving applications into the cloud, they're no longer monolithic and in a local data center. And so what happens when you have one problem that speaks IP and the other that speaks on the services? With our multi-cloud defense solutions, we're actually implementing the translation layer to implement policy in a unified way across both the local as well as the cloud-based services. And that is one way we can simplify it. The next thing that we've really started to focus on within Cisco with our Panoptica acquisition is how do we start to simplify the cloud-native application and protection platforms. And so within these public cloud services or any sort of cloud services, how do you start to look at what happens from a developer perspective in terms of wanting to be able to secure these cloud-native workloads? And so that's the workload, the API security, being able to implement runtime and the static analysis when you're building the code, and then the runtime analysis that's necessary when the code is running, and then being able to build in full stack observability. And so building out that whole cloud-native application protection platform becomes important, and then incorporating that directly into the DevOps process where policy can be defined as code, implemented, and then incorporated. And then finally, we want to talk just a little bit about from there, how do we start? Now, what we've talked about up till now is really about the evolution of simplification in protect and prevent technologies. Now let's talk about detect and respond. And so one of the key things we want to do is stopping ransomware threats. And what everybody's seen in ransomware is they're starting to develop in a very slow way and become more sophisticated. It used to be very simple emails, easy to detect. Nowadays, with AI technologies, the exploits are getting more sophisticated. Somebody recognizes on your social media platform you were at a party. They then send you an email that says, hey, here's some pictures from the party, reference your friend's name, and people are falling for these phishing attacks. That then makes a suspicious DNS query. The DNS query then downloads code. That malware, a PowerShell probably, then starts to worm through the network. What we're starting to do with our XDR solution, and again, this is the idea of picking up that cross-domain native telemetry information, bringing it together into a framework, and then being able to identify and be able to troubleshoot those environments allows us to do that in a more fully way. And through that, just maybe a better way of illustrating it, if all you're doing is aggregating telemetry across the environment, like with a SIEM, you get one view. When you start to have third-party telemetry, so being able to pull the data natively, you start to get a better view. And once you have cross-domain native telemetry, you get a complete view of the potential risk or threats within your environment. In terms of Cisco, as we start to focus on that detect and respond capability and bringing all of that information together so that it's actually correlated and actionable and doing it in the context of, like, for example, the MITRE ATT&CK framework, it's all powered by our underlying Talos threat intelligence system, where we're processing over 400 billion security events per day. We have over 500 threat researchers that are building up these models in collaboration with not only all of you, but also across the industry, and then bringing that all together. And as we do that, with CISCO Security Cloud, we're looking at not only how do we drive innovation, but also the simplification of security operations in a way that's better for the users, simpler for IT, optimized for developers, and safer for everyone. And with that, Thank you very much for the time today, and look forward to talking to all of you.